Hi students, so I can't be with you today because I am home with my son and he is sick, and that would of course be the way that this week has worked because we are clearly destined not to see each other before this test. So what I'm going to do is try to go through a lot of the notes and stuff that I went through 5th period with when I was actually there yesterday, and then you can go through this on your own. It's a video, so you can pause it and stop it when you need to, but I'm just going to go through a couple of the things that I was going to go through with you guys in class and hopefully clarify things before you actually sit down to take the test. And then if you have any questions after we go through all of this, if they're pressing, you can email me because I'll be home all day. Or you can just wait until Friday, and I will be back on Friday, so you could come and see me before school, or you could just wait until class if you have any questions. But a few other things I'm going to go through today. The first thing I want you guys to make sure you do is to finish your presentations of the chapters that you guys were reviewing, because we didn't really have a chance to go through and review those chapters. And a lot happens in those chapters because it's leading us up to the conclusion of the story with the Phelpses. And so I want you guys to go ahead and give your presentations and do your skits before you do anything with this video. So if you have not finished the presentations for all 6 factions and gone through the skits, I want you to just stop the video and do that first, and then we'll come back to these handouts. So a couple of the things we're going to do today, and for me it's now tonight. I'm sitting on my couch doing this, which is kind of nice. Sorry for you guys. The first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about some literary terms that we didn't have a chance to discuss at length. And the first one is this idea of satire, which we mentioned a lot as we went through the story. We're going to try to come up with some specific examples of satire because I think that will help you on the test and help you maybe understand the story at the end of it a little bit better. Then we're going to talk about a couple more literary terms that did show up on the study guide that I want you to be familiar with because they're sort of fleshed out as we hit the end of the story. We'll talk a little bit about the study guide and what's on it and what you need to know. Remember that the reading guide is due on Friday. I'm going to collect that before the test, so if you have some time in class today, you're welcome to work on that reading guide and to get that finished to turn it on Friday. Make sure you have the book finished by Friday too. I feel like that kind of goes without saying, but just in case you forgot. And I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about some of the presentations because, obviously, again, because we're destined not to see each other ever, I'm going to be gone on Monday and Tuesday at a grading conference in Indianapolis with some of the other teachers. So I am not going to be there on Monday and Tuesday. And so if you look at the master calendar for the class, I have you guys set up to work on your presentations. And so I'm going to walk through what those presentations are going to look like with you today. And I'm also going to put you into partners to do that. You can thank Kelly Plyman in the other class for suggesting that you work in partners. I was going to have you working individually, but she came up with that great idea. So I was very happy about that because I actually think it'll help you a lot. So we'll walk through that together. And then, like I said, if you have any questions, you can email me. So if you guys have not done the chapter reviews with the skits, go ahead and do that. You can turn your written summaries into the sub so that the sub has those. So I can give you credit for those. And while I'm not there to see your skits, which I'm obviously very sad about, I know the talent will be stunning, and so I'm not too worried about that. So if you guys have not finished that, go ahead and do that. The first thing we're going to do is this activity, and it's called The Adventures of Huck Finn Taking Aim. If you want a hard copy of this activity, you can ask the sub. It's in the front of the classroom in the folder that's marked Honors 10 today. And it's just a handout, and there should be enough for everybody if you guys want to do it. Or I'm going to share this with you in Google Docs, and you can make a copy and write on it. I am going to collect this, so you can either turn in a hard copy to the sub, or you can just share it with me. So what I'd like you guys to do is to take some time. I'm going to walk you through what this is, and then I want you to work on it a little bit. I'm going to have you get together in your factions and do an activity talking about some of these things. So when we're looking at this, oh gosh, that's not what I meant to do. Anyway, when we're looking at this, this technology. Up on top it says, in the events that Mark Twain relates to in the story, he generally accomplishes the second purpose of making broader comments on the failings of individuals in society. And that's, when we look at satire, it's basically Mark Twain making comments or making fun of or making a statement about some of the things that are happening in society regarding whether it's slavery or those individuals or whatever. He exposes some of those failings through his use of satire. So what I'm asking you to do here, this is going back a little bit, what I'm asking you to do is use your books and go through and find these passages here. And I told you where they were at here and kind of where to stop. What I'd like you to do is, on your own, go through, read those paragraphs, And then I want you to decide what you think Twain is satirizing. What he's making a statement about, or what is he poking fun at, or what is he trying to kind of make an example of. Remember, we talked about satire. One example that everyone understood was this whole idea of like Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live does these skits, and they're funny, but a lot of times they're poking fun at things that are actually happening in our society, and everybody recognizes that, and that's what makes it funny. So, some of the examples I gave you down here of things to look at that Twain often satirizes in a lot of his writings, but specifically in Huck Finn. The first one is this idea of feuding, and people who are feuding, and what the feuds are about or maybe not about. And so in this case, I want you to see if any of the examples I gave you here deal with this whole idea of Twain making fun of or mocking or making an example of feuding. This next one here is greed. I want you to see if any of these examples up here deal with Twain talking about or making fun of greed, people being greedy, people wanting things that maybe they don't deserve. This next one here is gullibility. And remember that the quality of being gullible is that you are easily fooled, you believe something if it's told to you without even checking whether or not that statement is reliable or whatever. This next one here is the sentimentality of people, where we see people sort of following just their feelings rather than their intellect, and they rely on their feelings to help them make decisions, and so they sometimes make the wrong decisions. So I want you to think about in these stories, and I would think, specifically once we really get into those chapters with the Wilkes girls, that's where we see a lot of that. But in these chapters up here, to make it easier, do you see any of those examples? This next one here is fascination for ceremony, and that's any time that we just see people sort of going through things without thinking about what is the point behind it, or why are we doing it? Are we just doing it because this, historically the thing we've always done? That's Facebook Messenger. That's good. This next one here is religious hypocrisy, and that's where we have, basically people who are claiming to be religious, and we're talking specifically here with Twain, we're talking about Christians, but people are, claiming to be religious, and in doing so, they are actually being hypocritical, or they are being hypocrites. So I want you to think of times in the story where we see people claiming to be Christian, but, doing things that are unchristian, or claiming that they are following a certain, a path that is religious, but in reality their actions are something else. This next one is people's curiosity. Where do you see people being curious about things that maybe, I don't know, I would say are things that, pique people's interest for some odd reason and cause them to go and see something that they might not otherwise have gone and taken the time to see, just because they are curious about it. And think about, when we think about today, things that people look at on the internet, or things like reality TV shows, people's curiosity is piqued, and so they go and they seek those things out just because they're kind of weird, which is obviously a little weird. This next one here is uncultured taste, which I would just think of in terms of, when we think of the word distasteful, we're talking about things that maybe a person should not be interested in because it's kind of weird. It could be something like bad manners. It could be something that's seen as not being, civilized, maybe. And we see a lot of that in the beginning of the book. And this last one here is pseudo-intellectualism. And obviously, we're talking here about when people are pretending to be intellectual about something and they're really not. Like when people are maybe acting like know-it-alls about something, but then it turns out all of their information comes from like Wikipedia or something. So anytime you see that kind of example. So looking at this handout, what I'd like you to do is on your own go through and read these here. I want you to then go to this word bank, and I want you to see if you can find which of these would match up with these sections up here. And that might mean that you have, of this word bank, multiple words or phrases for some of these. Like for chapter 4, you might say, well, it's these two or it's these three. So long as you can explain why, you can have multiples. All of these will be used at least once, but there's no requirement on, how much you have to use them. So I want you guys to take a few minutes and go ahead and do that. So just pause the video here on your own, do that, and then we'll come back when you're ready. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get together in our factions. What I'd like you guys to do is either on a sheet of blank paper, if you are using this handout, you can go ahead and just flip it over. I'd like you guys to do in your factions is I'd like you to get together, and even though I've scribbled all over this, hopefully you can still see what we're talking about here. For these examples down here, I'd like you guys to see if you can think of in society some examples of modern day things that apply to these kind of topics. So when we look at Twain satirizing these topics, where do we see these topics in today's society? I think that might help you a little bit in terms of making connections to the things that Twain is kind of making fun of and poking fun at. So, for example, the first one is feuding. I want you to think of some example in society today where we see people feuding over something, whether it's something kind of stupid like the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, like they're feuding over something but they can't actually remember what they're feuding over, or if it is something, more, I don't know, like ISIS or something, that would be more of an extremism type thing. So go through these things and see if you can come up with some examples of these, okay, within your factions, and just jot them down. So take a little bit of time for that and go ahead and finish that, and then we'll go ahead and we'll move on to the next activity. So this next activity we're going to work on, there is a hard copy of this worksheet up in the front of the classroom, and you can get that from the sub if you want. That's in the Honors 10 folder for today. So what we're going to talk about, and I've also shared this with you so you can just make a copy of it online, we're going to talk about are some of the literary terms that we've covered initially before. Like up here we have already talked about irony before. We've obviously also talked about satire. That was like just now, so hopefully you remember that. And this last one is Picaro. We're going to talk about whether or not Huck fits into this definition. So I'd like you to do is on your Chromebooks, or if you want to be old school, you can go and use the dictionaries that are over kind of in the far side of the room by that bust of Dante. What I'd like you to do is look up the definitions of these words and go ahead and write down the definitions as they are. And remember, we're looking for as they apply to, literature. We did talk about irony already. Remember, there's a difference between, situational irony, dramatic irony, verbal irony. So kind of think about that. And then what I'd like you to do once you have that definition down and you do know you understand it, I would like you to come up with some examples of irony that you see in Huck Finn. Sometimes that you see irony in Huck Finn. Whatever kind of irony you do see. And we're working on our own on this, and I'm going to go through this with you here. The second one here might be satire. I want you to see any time, after you look up the definition of satire, any times that you see Mark Twain, again, using satire to poke fun of something or to make fun of a certain type of person or to make a statement about something within the context of this book. So think about that, examples of satire you have seen. And then this third term, what I'd like you to do, look it up and then tell me, does this definition fit Huck? And some people in the other class said, well, not only Huck, but what about Jim? What about the Duke and the Dolphin? I said, yeah, that's fine. So you can do them too as well. So what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes here. You can pause the video. And then I'm actually going to walk through this with you. So work on this on your own. Take a few minutes to finish this here. This will probably take you, 5-10 minutes if you're working well. And then I'm going to go ahead and walk through some examples with you here. So stop the video, work on it, I'll pick back up with you. So some examples that I'd like to go through with you, and you do not have to have these examples, as there are a lot of examples in Huck Finn that hopefully you came up with. I'm just going to give you a few, some examples of irony. One example of irony, and I'm not sure that writing on here is a good idea given the stylus I'm using. It's like using a giant magic marker or something. But one example of irony I will give you is, nope, that's not it, the fact that Huck and Jim are going down the river. See, you can see why writing on this was just a terrible idea. But going down the river, seeking freedom, and what they end up with is Jim being back into slavery. So one thing that somebody in the other class said was ironic is they spend this whole trip going down the river trying to help Jim get his freedom, and at the end of the story, Jim does get his freedom, but before that, he is technically captured into slavery, even though, again, Miss Watson has died at the end of the story and has freed Jim in her will, so technically he's not a slave, but you know what I mean. That is ironic. One other thing that's ironic that also plays into that is the fact that this whole time, Huck and Jim have been thinking that Jim was a runaway slave, and in their minds he was, but legally he was not. Legally, Miss Watson did free him, so he actually was just like a black man going down the river. So that is ironic as well. And whatever other examples you had, as long as your group can kind of vouch for you here in terms of your faction, whatever you said has to make sense. But those are a couple of examples of irony that hopefully help you. Talked a little bit about satire in the last activity that we just did. And some examples of satire that have come up in terms of Huck Finn. I'm not going to try to write on this again. This clearly didn't work out. Some examples of satire in the story that we have seen. Thinking of the things that Twain pokes fun at. One, like we said in the other thing, is religious hypocrisy. The fact that Widow Douglas and Miss Watson are kind of hell-bent on giving Huck this religious education and teaching him from the Bible and taking him to church. But in reality, one unchristian-like thing that they do is they own slaves. Some other examples of satire we see in Pap's government speech, when he talks about how unfair it is that they would let a black man, who in his mind, that black man should be a slave just because he's black, but he's not because he comes from a free state and he's a free man. They let him vote, but they won't let Pap vote because they say that he is too drunk to go and vote. And so Pap says that the government is all screwed up. And so Twain there is kind of poking fun at this whole idea of what gives someone the right to vote. What makes someone eligible to be, a decent voter. And the fact that Pap thinks that he is, more fit to vote than this freedman from Ohio who is actually a professor. And that would, I guess, kind of be irony as well. Twain pokes fun, to some extent, of the people we see, and I asked you this on the reading guide, as we make our way down south, some of the people he stereotypes, the poor people on the streets of Arkansas, the people who fall for the Duke and the Dauphin, all their con men tricks, all the people who are stupid enough to go and fall for it, because that's just sort of who they are. He's poking fun at those kind of people as well. So those would be some examples of satire. And then this last one, Picaro, is just a rogue or a vagabond, and hopefully you know those terms here. Rogue is one. That's what I like to call Sam Ruff a rogue, and I told you that in class once because that's just who he is. What he isn't is a vagabond. And a vagabond typically refers to someone who's more like a hobo. So in this case, the question is, does Huck fit into that definition? And I would say yes, because Huck does kind of go rogue in that he decides to run away with an escaped slave, even though, again, they don't realize that later on he's been freed. His decision to run away with an escaped slave and the things that they do and that they get away with are pretty bold, and they're things that I don't even think Tom Sawyer would have done, but Huck does do them, and so there's something to be said for that, I think. The fact that he does do those things, and that he is very brave, and he shows a lot of bravery with something that a lot of people might have not shown bravery with. And then he's a vagabond because they're essentially homeless people. They're living on a raft, they are stealing food, they're just sort of getting by, and so that does make them kind of like vagabonds. So, something to think about. I have a couple final terms here that I want you to know. One is the term Bildungsroman, and if you're thinking that doesn't look like English, that's because it's not English. And the second one here is Deus Ex Machina. That's a C right there. I want you to take a minute here, pause the video, and go ahead and look these up online, just on your Chromebooks. You will probably not find these in the dictionaries in my room, so it's one advantage to the Chromebooks. So I want you to take a minute, look these two terms up, and come back here when you're ready. And this first term, Bildungsroman, I put on your study guide because the Bildungsroman typically refers to a story where we see a lot of growth in typically the protagonist of the story. And that growth is typically moral, or sometimes it can be like an intellectual growth. An example might be something you might be familiar with, might be like Triss in Divergent, that we see her growing as the story goes on, and as she kind of changes and has to deal with challenges, she changes as a person, and she grows, and she begins to understand new things about herself that lead her to kind of new discoveries of what it is she's capable of. So the question is, is this story considered a Bildungsroman? or a story in which that main character does show a lot of growth? And the answer is, well, sort of, because during the course of the story, one question I asked you a lot is, where do we see Huck's moral conscience sort of forming and him understanding things about himself and learning? And the answer is that happens from, the time that he chooses to leave and to break away from his, capture with Pap, forever ago in that cabin over on the Illinois side of the river. And so that's interesting to think about, because we see, Huck, for someone his age, showing kind of a lot of self-awareness. He's aware from the very beginning of the story that he does not want to be civilized. He's aware that Pap is a bad father, all of those things. And then throughout the course of the story, he really does grow in his understanding of what it means to be a friend and why slavery is wrong and what Jim means to him. And as time goes on, he does begin to develop these feelings in which he understands that Jim is not just like a piece of property and is not just something to be passed, from hand to hand, but actually someone who cares about him. And there's that moment in the story where he takes that letter that he wrote to Miss Watson in these last few chapters here, takes the letter he wrote to Miss Watson, and he tears it up, and he says that he would rather go to hell than to find a way to get Jim back to Miss Watson. Again, at this point, the story doesn't know Miss Watson's dead or that Jim is free, but the idea is he understands what hell is, and he is willingly choosing to do the wrong thing in the eyes of society. He's willing to help Jim escape, and that's a huge deal. That's really kind of what we see to be, I guess, the apex of his moral development. The problem happens when Tom Sawyer comes into the story, and Tom Sawyer, in convincing Huck to plan this kind of romantic escape that he has read about in all of his, mystery novels and that kind of thing, adventure novels, planning this grand escape for Jim in which they require him to do, the stupidest things. They want him to, keep a pet in this little area he's being kept in. They want him to water a plant with his tears. They want him to keep a journal on a shirt. And they could just choose, Tom could choose, but so could Huck, they could just choose to set Jim free. And it wouldn't take anything. Like, he's barely being guarded at the Phelps' house. They're just kind of keeping him there. They could just let him go. And at one point, they actually they let him out of the little area he's being kept in, and they have him go down and get like a big rock and bring it back up as part of their plan. So, like, they could just let him walk away, and they don't. And part of that is because Tom Sawyer has all these grand visions for what a real breakout of a slave should look like. And that's awful, because Tom Sawyer actually knows that Jim is free. He knows that because he came from St. Petersburg, Missouri, and he knows that Miss Watson has died and freed her slaves in her will, and still he chooses not to tell Huck this, and Huck goes along with it. So the question is it a Bildungsroman when Huck regresses? So at the end of the story, in theory, if this is a Bildungsroman, Huck should be able to stand up to Tom Sawyer and say, no, we're not doing this. This plan is ridiculous. I am not going along with this. This has to stop. This is going to stop here with me. And he doesn't do that. He plays along with Tom Sawyer because Tom Sawyer is the leader and Huck allows himself to be taken along for the ride. So the question is, and this is just something to kind of dwell on, is this a Bildungsroman if all of the progress that Huck has made during the course of the story just stops when Tom Sawyer shows up? So that's something to kind of think about, and I am going to ask you about that a little bit on the test, so think about that. The second term I want you to look up, and hopefully you have and you understand here, is this idea of deus ex machina. So this is a term that's used a lot when we talk about drama, but in this case, it also comes into play in some stories, and the idea is deus ex machina is used sometimes when, or it's people accuse it or say that an author is using it when they feel that the author has gotten him or herself into a situation that cannot be easily explained anymore. Like something amazing or, in many cases, unconvincing has to happen for the plot to be tied up. And so a lot of times in stories or in tragedies, deus ex machina happens when a very implausible ending happens, and it seems like sometimes that ending just happened to sort of tie things up. There are people who say that one of the downfalls of Huck Finn is that it does have this deus ex machina ending, in that the ending does feel very contrived. Like Huck and Jim are finally away from the Duke and the Dauphin, making their way down the river, and something has to happen. What ends up happening is we throw in this random Phelps family that just so coincidentally happens to be related to Tom Sawyer. And not only that, but as Huck is walking up to their house, they are like literally expecting Tom Sawyer to walk up and have not seen him in many years, and thus don't recognize Huck for who he is. They think he's Tom Sawyer because they haven't seen Tom Sawyer in forever. Statistically, what are the chances that Huck would walk up to a farm in Arkansas, and those people would also happen to be related, to Tom Sawyer? I mean, it's pretty small, especially given the timing that Tom Sawyer himself, is arriving at the same exact time. So there are some people who say that's contrived, and the other people say that what ends up happening, which is that Miss Watson turns out to be dead and has freed Jim in her will, and so a lot of this time he wasn't even a slave. This time that they were running down the river and stuff, people say that that was contrived as well, and that it's just almost too easily wrapped up. So when we're talking about Deus Ex Machina, something I want you to think about here is, is this ending, does it feel real to you, or does it feel contrived? Does it feel false? Does it feel too convenient that he would end up at the Phelps farm, that Jim would end up being free, and that's just how the story ends? Like, okay, Jim, you're done. You can do whatever you want now. And Huck's like, yeah, I'm going out west. Is that contrived? Do you think Mark Twain got himself into a situation where he did not know how to end this story, and so he threw those things in as a way to wrap it up? We don't know. We can't ask him because he's dead. But that is something to think about. And again, I'm going to ask you about that on the test is, what are we looking at here in terms of the ending of the story and what actually happens? So think about that. The next thing that we are going to do is look at the study guide for the test. I did not give you a hard copy of this. This is just something I shared with you in an email entitled Snow Day Fun. So if you can go ahead and find that, I'm just going to walk you through some of the things that you'll need to know for the test. I warned you about this. The test does have a quotes matching section. And so in the quotes matching section, I'm going to give you a quote, and I'm going to give you a name bank here. And I'm going to ask you to match those quotes with a name bank. There are also some multiple choice questions that deal with the characters in the story. So if you're looking at this list and thinking, oh, I don't know who some of these people are, probably a good idea to get that figured out and rectify that situation before you sit down and take the test. In the other class, the student said, well, I can't sometimes remember the difference between Miss Watson and Widow Douglas. I'm not going to ask you things like that. I'm not going to ask you, well, what color was Mrs. Loftus's hair? But you do need to know the difference between, these major players here. And the questions that are about them are generally major plot movements. So that's something, if you've read the book, you should be okay. If not, I'm not sure what to tell you, but you have a little bit of time. This next thing here is the vocab activity. I share that with you, and you have that just in case you do not have your corrected version. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to give you a word bank, and it'll have like the little bank up here. Okay. It'll have like all the vocab words in it. Okay, there they are. They look like bacon. All the vocab words. And then I'm going to give you some sentences. And I'm going to I'll write the sentences, blah, blah, blah. And I will take out the vocab word and ask you to pick the vocab word from this section up here that fits in best. One thing I'm going to do to try to help you a little bit is when I give you these sentences here, I'm going to tell you what part of speech goes there. So for sentence 3, for number 3, I'll make up a sentence, and I will say like an adjective goes here. So you're going to have to go up to this word bank here and think which of these words, as we learn them, are adjectives, which are adverbs. So one thing I did when I graded that vocabulary activity is I did try to go through and correct your answer. So if you said something was an adjective, I marked it as an adverb, and my expectation is that you can go back into that and see that and understand that, because I think having an idea of what parts of speech these words are is going to make them a lot easier. I know some of them are colloquialisms, so they're not even like, real phrases that we'd see written necessarily, but for the sake of this, we'll go with that. So if you have questions on this vocab, or you cannot find the vocab words in your email or something, tell me ahead of time, because it's not a huge part of the test, but it's a decent part of the test. Okay. Down here, I gave you a list of some terms I want you to be familiar with. Some of these are just phrases. Some of them are places. They have some meaning. Okay? Some of them are just concepts that we talked about. So for all of these things, I just want you to make sure that these all ring a bell. So all these things that you're looking at here, you should be saying like, yes, I know what that is. I know what that is. Just be aware of them. Think about major plot movements going on around them. There will be some multiple choice questions, mostly about these, but you do need to understand, the setting of the story, the time period of the story, that kind of thing. This last part of the study guide deals with some of the themes that were in there, okay? And I'm going to give you an essay question here at the end of the test. And this isn't the essay question because I don't want to give it to you because it's kind of long, and really you should be able to answer it, on the spot, hopefully. What I want you to do is kind of reflect on these themes up here and think about how those things might be relevant to someone who is your age. So a high schooler who is reading Huck Finn. And we saw these themes when we were reading Huck Finn, this whole idea of coming of age, which is just growing up, Huck's, experiences of growing up. The idea of Bildungsroman, which we just talked about. And also Huck's search for his identity, his acknowledgement that he doesn't want to be civilized, but he understands that his life with Pap is obviously not an ideal one. This idea of social responsibility, what responsibility do we have to, other humans? If we see something wrong being done, what is our responsibility to fix that? This idea that Huck deals with, which really is like civilization versus uncivilization, but conformity, having to conform to society's beliefs. We see in the slave community, but also in Huck and, his people, this idea of superstitions. We saw it with Pap and Huck, as well as within the slave community, but this idea of they have these superstitions about things, and there might be no proof to them, but they exist. It's almost like a social custom. So that's something to think about, how those things shape a lot of what happens in the story. One of the big themes of this story is this idea of friendship and betrayal. There's not a whole lot of betrayal going on in the story, but there is some. And at the end, especially, involving Jim and Huck, although Jim doesn't seem particularly bitter, it happens. But this idea of this developing friendship that happens between Huck and Jim and what it comes to mean to Huck. And one of the most, I wouldn't say moving, like I wasn't crying or anything, not hard anyway, but passages of the book is when he remembers his time on the raft with Jim, right before he's about to rip up that letter to Miss Watson. Remembers his time on the raft with Jim and how Jim said that, Huck was his best friend and he would take care of Huck, and he realizes that, he likes Jim as a person. Like he wasn't just, a slave along for the ride. The idea of freedom versus enslavement, this idea that people were enslaving slaves because that was what they had done for a long time and it was legal, and so there was no reason not to. But what freedom means to Jim. And you remember Jim, one of his proudest moments in the story is when he says, I'm worth $800. I'm rich. And all I have to do is just be me. I'm worth $800. Well, it's sad because later on he ends up getting sold, obviously, for a lot less than that to Silas Phelps. But it's there. The last one is this idea of intellectual versus moral education. And Huck says, that going to school in the very beginning of the story, he's learning things, and that's nice and stuff. But Huck always seems to feel like a real life experience is what's more meaningful, and it's almost like he learns more when he's on the raft with Jim than he probably ever could have in school, and that's something to think about. And there will be an essay on that. So if you have any questions about the essay before the test, you can come and see me, and if not, we'll move on. The next thing we're going to talk about is something I'm going to share with you, and there's, again, also a hard copy in the front of the room if you want it, is our next big thing. So typically at the end of Huck Finn, I would do an essay, but just for the time we've spent on Huck Finn, I think a lot of it would end up just being a repetition, like you'd basically just be repeating all the things that you did in the tests and on the essay and in your reading guides and that we talked about. And I think it might be a little more beneficial to do a presentation instead. And so I came up with this a couple years ago, and the students who did it typically did pretty well with it. So I'm going to do kind of a variation on that. what we're going to do, and a lot of this is not going to make sense until you actually get into the project, so if while I'm talking you're thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about, come back to this and maybe listen to this video again once you have chosen one of these, and it will make a little bit more sense. So when we're talking about literary theories, and you can just take a minute maybe and Google what is a literary theory, that might be helpful, and then come back here. But a literary theory is basically a framework for understanding literature. So you can read a story and be like, this story is about this. But you can also frame a story in a different context. Like you can look at a story through the perspective of what was happening in history at this time. How did that impact the story? You know, stories can't ever stand alone. And so one thing that would be integral to understanding Huck Finn is obviously understanding what was going on in society at that time, in the 1840s, in these slaveholding states. How does that help us better understand Huck Finn? Another framework for looking at a story might be understanding, this here is feminism, and how women in the story are portrayed when thinking about, you know, maybe typical stereotyped even roles of women in society. That might be something to think about. So what different literary theories do is they basically give you like a framework to put around the story that you're reading as a way to better understand or analyze it. And obviously we don't want to like analyze things to death. But the reality is Huck Finn is not just a story about like a white kid and a black guy going down a river in a raft. Like there's a lot more to that story. So the question is, how can we frame that story so that we can better understand maybe Twain's purpose or what Twain was looking for, or as readers we can just sort of reflect and analyze what's going on in that story. So what you are going to do is I'm going to put you into a partner set, and I'm going to email you a list, and everyone is going to get a partner. And what you're going to do is you and your partner over the next few days here, and I would like you to maybe get together before the weekend and pick a literary theory to start so you can at least do some independent work over the weekend, and then on Monday and Tuesday when I am gone you will have all day to work on putting this together. A whole class period for both of those will be for this, except for the vocab stuff, but that's easy. I'm just going to release the quiz to you at the beginning of class and you can take it whenever. So get together with your partner here sometime between now and Monday and pick one of these literary theories. And like I said, I don't want to go too much into them because you'll be able to Google them and read a little bit about them. And I would encourage you to try to find, you know, just a very basic explanation. There are unfortunately, a lot of very bad student projects out there on the internet. That's sad for me and for you. So I really would highly encourage you, don't Google like Huck Finn and New Historicism or Huck Finn and Psychoanalytic Theory, because in my experience, the stuff you're going to get is either college level stuff, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand, or it's going to be like student written websites, and those students may not be where you are, for lack of a better phrase, and you don't rely on it. So I really would like to see you doing the best you can. I understand that this is a difficult project, but do what you can to try to pick a literary theory, understand it, and then apply it. And what I like for you to do is pick 3 or 4 key scenes in Huck Finn, so like major plot movements, like the things that happened at the Phelps house, or the reveal that Jim was free the whole time, or the Grangerford-Shepherdson feud. So like major scenes, major events in the story. And I want you to understand and explain to the class how the literary theory you have chosen provides a framework for understanding these questions better. Okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to create a Google presentation. Your first slide will probably just be you explaining the literary theory you have chosen and maybe why you chose that literary theory. And then your next few slides, you might have a slide each for like these bullet points up here. And what I want you to do is just reflect on these questions in the framework of that literary theory. Okay? So let's say you choose New Historicism. New Historicism is my favorite literary theory, and I just really like it. So let's say you use New Historicism here. And this first question is, why does Twain reveal the story as he does? What I'd like you to do is read up on New Historicism. Try to get a good grasp of it. And then I want you to answer this question in the context of it. So you might say something like, Twain reveals the story to the readers as he does because he wants his readers to have an understanding of the history of the time and also to just better understand what is going on socially. So in the societies at the time in terms of things like, slave ownership and that sort of thing. And also just roles in society, the roles that people play. Okay, so go through these here and just answer these the best you can using your framework. It does not have to be perfect. If you have questions about this as you're starting to work on it, I will be able to access my email when I am at that conference in the evenings and stuff. So you can email me questions. Don't email me the whole presentation and say, how does this look? Because I'm going to respond with, yeah, that looks fine. If that's what you think is your best work, that's fine. But if you are not understanding something, like let's say this question here, you don't understand what is the effect of what he does. You're not sure. You don't know what the effect of what he does is. You don't know how to frame that within this idea of New Historicism. Ask me, and I'll see if I can walk you through it. The biggest thing I want you to think about is try not to confuse yourself. Try to understand this literary theory, and just, even if you can't answer these specifically, try to give us some idea of why you think this literary theory helps us better understand Huck Finn. Okay? If you have any questions, now that we are done with this, you can ask each other. You can take a minute here and send me an email. With the time that is left in block here, hopefully you have some. What I would like you to do is work on your reading guide. And you have that and you have your book. You can also start working on vocab review units 4 through 6. And those are due on Monday at 3 o'clock. So if you have any questions, send me an email. And on that note, I will sign off from the iPad. Bye. Miss Ketch's foray into technology and learning is not, flipped classroom quality, but it's something. So, bye-bye.